In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung experienced something that would either destroy him or transform everything he understood about human consciousness. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. For months, he descended into visions that blurred the boundary between madness and revelation. And in those depths, he discovered a pattern he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. A pattern he suspected might explain why certain individuals seem fundamentally displaced from the world around them. Not broken, not disordered, displaced. As if they were operating on a frequency the rest of humanity couldn't detect. He began documenting cases. Patients who described experiencing their memories not as a sequence but as a simultaneity. People who felt the weight of events before they occurred. Minds that refused to process reality in the neat, linear fashion that society demanded. And Jung began to wonder, what if this isn't pathology? What if this is evolution attempting to break through? What if some human beings are wired to perceive the architecture of time itself, and that perception makes them dangerous to every system built on predictability, compliance, and the illusion of control? If you've ever felt that clocks lie, that schedules suffocate, that your entire life has been an exhausting performance of pretending to move at the same speed as everyone else, then you may carry the signature Jung spent decades trying to decode. The one that makes you simultaneously invaluable and unbearable to a world that cannot afford to let you be free. The architecture of different perception. Jung's fascination with temporal consciousness began in an unlikely place, the asylum. While treating patients diagnosed with various psychoses, he noticed something his colleagues dismissed. Certain individuals described their experience of time collapsing, childhood memories surfacing with the vividness of immediate sensation, future anxieties manifesting as present-moment physical symptoms, the boundaries between then, now, and not yet dissolving entirely. The medical establishment called this dissociation, temporal disorientation, evidence of cognitive breakdown. Jung called it something else, differentiated perception. He theorized that consciousness itself might exist on a spectrum, that most human beings process reality through a lens optimized for survival in social structures. Sequential thinking, cause and effect reasoning. The ability to suppress past trauma and delay future gratification. But there existed a minority whose consciousness refused this optimization, who couldn't flatten experience into a convenient timeline, who felt the full dimensional weight of existence pressing against them from multiple directions simultaneously. These individuals, Jung suspected, weren't failing to adapt. They were adapted to perceive something others couldn't see. You recognize this in yourself, don't you? The way certain conversations feel like watching a script you've already read. The way you can sense the emotional residue in a room before anyone speaks. The way your body responds to stress that hasn't technically happened yet. Tightening, preparing, bracing for an impact only you can see approaching. This isn't anxiety disorder. This is your nervous system processing information across a wider temporal bandwidth than consensus reality typically accommodates. Western civilization runs on what the Greeks called chronos, the god of sequential, measurable, controllable time. The time of schedules, deadlines, quarterly reports. Time that can be bought, sold, managed, optimized. But you operate primarily through kairos, the god of opportune moments, of timing that cannot be forced, of the qualitative experience of duration rather than its quantitative measurement. Chronos asks, how many hours did you work? Kairos asks, were you present for the moments that mattered? This fundamental difference explains why you've struggled in environments that worship efficiency, why you can lose yourself for 8 hours in work that captivates you, but can barely endure 8 minutes of work that doesn't. Why people call you inconsistent, unreliable, scattered. when the truth is simply that you're consistent with a different organizing principle than they can perceive. Jung discovered this same pattern in himself during his break from Freud. Suddenly freed from the constraints of institutional psychology, his productivity didn't follow a predictable pattern. Some days produced nothing. Some days produced insights that would shape the field for the next century. He wrote about this realization, the terror and liberation of discovering that his creative process couldn't be scheduled, that the unconscious operated on its own timeline, that trying to force it into conventional productivity patterns was like trying to force a river to flow uphill. This is the first mark of the temporal heretic. You cannot be efficiently scheduled, not because you're undisciplined, but because the work that matters most to you emerges from depths that don't respond to deadlines. Modern neuroscience has begun confirming Jung's intuition. Research on transient hypofrontality, the state experienced during flow, shows that people with your consciousness profile spend significantly more time in altered temporal perception. Your sense of time literally changes. Minutes become hours. Hours become minutes. The ordinary clock becomes irrelevant. This neurological architecture makes you extraordinarily valuable in certain contexts: creative innovation, crisis response, paradigm-shifting insight. You can hold complexity that overwhelms linear thinkers. You can detect patterns before they fully emerge. But it also makes you incompatible with systems designed for predictability. The factory wants interchangeable parts. The corporation wants reliable outputs. The relationship wants consistent emotional availability. And you fluctuate, you spiral, you dive deep and surface changed. You cannot be counted on to be the same person from week to week because you're genuinely not. Jung understood. This isn't failure to develop properly. This is development beyond the baseline. The question isn't whether you can learn to be like everyone else. You can't. The question is whether you'll keep torturing yourself trying, or whether you'll finally accept that you were never meant to fit inside the container they've built. The philosopher's trap. Urgency as control mechanism. Niccolò Machiavelli spent his life studying power, how it's acquired, maintained, and lost. And one of his most penetrating insights was this: the ruler who controls the calendar controls the kingdom. Not through obvious tyranny, through something far more subtle: the manufactured crisis, the artificial deadline, the strategic deployment of urgency to prevent deep thinking. Keep people reacting and they never have time to reflect. Keep them busy and they never notice the bars of their cage. You've been subjected to this your entire life. The teacher who taught you that learning happens in 50-minute increments. The boss who measures productivity by hours logged rather than problems solved. The culture that glorifies exhaustion as evidence of value. All of it serves a purpose: to prevent you from discovering how much power you'd have if you ever stopped running. Because here's what the architects of urgency-based systems understand. People who control their own time are ungovernable. If you can step back from the frenzy and ask, is this actually important, or does someone just want me to believe it is? You become dangerous. You start seeing through the manipulation. You stop participating in the performance. Jung identified this pattern when analyzing collective psychology. He observed how societies create what he called mass-mindedness, the phenomenon where individual thinking gets absorbed into group momentum. And one of the primary tools of mass-mindedness is temporal pressure. When everyone is rushing, questioning becomes impossible. When the deadline looms, there's no space for reflection. When urgency dominates, importance becomes invisible. You've felt this acutely. The meetings that accomplish nothing but consume everything. The emails marked urgent that aren't. The endless treadmill of tasks that keep you moving but never advancing. And beneath it all, you've sensed the truth. Most of what's labeled urgent is actually trivial. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately as a power dynamic. Those who control urgency control behavior. Make someone believe their job depends on immediate response and you've eliminated their capacity for strategic thought. But here's where Jung and Machiavelli converge on a radical insight. The refusal of false urgency is a revolutionary act, not rebellion for its own sake, strategic sovereignty. When you look at urgency and ask, according to whom? For what purpose? What actually happens if I don't react immediately? You're performing a Machiavellian analysis. You're interrogating the power structure embedded in temporal demands. Most people never do this. They accept urgency at face value because they've been conditioned to believe that responsiveness equals responsibility. You know better. You've discovered, probably through painful trial and error, that your best work emerges not from reaction but from deliberation, not from speed but from depth, not from constant availability but from protected immersion. This makes you a problem for systems designed around extraction. The gig economy wants you responding instantly. The attention economy wants you constantly checking. The productivity industrial complex wants you believing that every moment not spent working is a moment wasted. But Jung's research into creative individuals revealed something these systems desperately want hidden. The most valuable contributions come from people who protect their time fiercely. The great works of art, science, philosophy, they don't emerge from hustlers. They emerge from individuals who understood that depth requires duration. That insight needs incubation. That transformation cannot be rushed. Nietzsche articulated this when he wrote that every profound spirit needs a mask, not to hide, but to create distance from the demands of the shallow world, to build a buffer between depth and distraction. Your version of the mask might be boundaries that others call rigid. It might be unavailability that others call selfish. It might be standards that others call unrealistic. Let them call it what they want, because the alternative is sacrificing the important on the altar of the urgent, and arriving at the end of your life having responded to everything while creating nothing. The Machiavellian move here isn't to reject all urgency. It's to weaponize it selectively. When you need to ship, when the deadline serves your purpose, when urgency aligns with importance, use it. Let the pressure compress your focus into diamond clarity. But when urgency is wielded against your sovereignty, when it's designed to prevent the work that actually matters, recognize it as the manipulation it is. Jung called this conscious participation versus unconscious identification. Most people unconsciously identify with external demands. You must consciously participate, choosing when to engage and when to withdraw. This requires disappointing people, regularly, without apology. And that brings us to the shadow that lurks in this awareness. The productivity demon. When your strength devours you, there's a particular trap Jung identified in individuals with heightened consciousness. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of anything pushed to its extreme to transform into its opposite. And nowhere is this more dangerous than in your relationship with productivity. You discovered early that you're capable of extraordinary intensity. When something captures you, you can work with a focus that borders on possession. Hours dissolve, food becomes optional, sleep feels like interruption. You enter a state where you and the work become indistinguishable. This capacity is both your greatest asset and your most lethal vulnerability, because you've learned to associate your worth with your output. And once that neural pathway gets carved deep enough, it becomes a prison. Jung encountered this repeatedly in his practice. High-functioning individuals who came to him not with the complaint of doing too little, but of being unable to stop doing. People driven by an internal taskmaster so relentless that rest felt like moral failure. He recognized this as the shadow side of the achievement archetype. The shadow isn't just the parts of yourself you reject. It's any psychological content that operates autonomously. possessing you rather than being integrated by you. And for people with your architecture, the drive to produce can become a possessing force as tyrannical as any addiction. You know this pattern intimately. The 2 a.m. self-interrogations where you catalog your inadequacies, the guilt that floods in during any moment of stillness, the voice that whispers, everyone else is building empires while you're wasting time. The inability to enjoy success because you're already focused on the next mountain to climb. This isn't motivation. This is the internalized voice of a culture that profits from your self-rejection. Capitalism discovered something profound. You don't need to force people to work themselves to death if you can convince them to do it voluntarily. Just make them believe their value is conditional, that they must earn their right to exist through ceaseless production. That rest is for the mediocre and ambition requires sacrifice. And people with your capability? You'll run yourself into the ground trying to prove you're worthy of the oxygen you breathe. Jung saw through this immediately. He understood that the real question isn't, how productive can I be? But what am I trying to outrun through productivity? Because often the addiction to doing is a defense against being, against sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, against facing the existential questions that emerge in silence, against the terror that maybe beneath all the achievement you're not actually enough. This is the shadow speaking. And it's a liar. Your worth isn't contingent on your output. Your value doesn't fluctuate with your productivity. You are not the sum of your accomplishments or the list of your failures. You are the consciousness that witnesses both. But integrating this truth requires something the productivity demon desperately wants to prevent. Genuine rest. Not the exhausted collapse after pushing too hard, not the guilty scrolling that fills empty hours, not the vacation where you're still checking email. Real rest, the kind where you're present with yourself without agenda, where you allow the soil of your psyche to lie fallow so the next season can grow. Jung practiced this through what he called active imagination, deliberately entering dialogue with the parts of himself that the conscious mind had exiled. The lazy part, the frightened part, the part that wanted to quit. When he stopped trying to suppress these aspects and started listening to them, he discovered they weren't trying to destroy him. They were trying to protect him from the part that would work him to death. This is the integration that transforms the demon into an ally. You don't kill the drive to achieve. You bring it into conscious relationship. You ask it, what are you trying to prove? What are you afraid will happen if I stop? And then you listen. Often what emerges is a child's fear. The belief that love is conditional, that acceptance must be earned, that you'll be abandoned if you're not constantly valuable. These wounds didn't originate with you. They're inherited, passed down through generations that survived by being useful, by making themselves indispensable, by never admitting weakness or need. But you can be the one who breaks the pattern. Nietzsche wrote about this as the death of the old gods and the birth of new values. You cannot build a new life on the foundation of the old wounds. You must consciously choose different organizing principles, not productivity for its own sake, but creativity as self-expression, not achievement as proof of worth, but contribution as natural overflow, not exhaustion as evidence of effort, but depth as the measure of meaning. This recalibration requires mourning. You have to grieve the version of yourself that believed worth could be earned through performance. That person tried so hard, sacrificed so much, and never received the acceptance they were chasing because it was always one more accomplishment away. Let that version rest. What emerges after the grief is something Jung called the individuated self, the person who has integrated the opposites, who can be both ambitious and content, who can strive without suffering, who can produce without proving. This is the person you're becoming if you let the demon die. the digital invasion reclaiming your temporal sovereignty. Jung died in 1961 before the digital revolution rewired human consciousness, but his work predicted exactly what was coming. He warned about the dangers of what he called psychic infection, the unconscious absorption of external influences that colonize the interior landscape. In his era, the threats were propaganda, mass media, collective hysteria. In yours, they're algorithmic. Every platform you interact with, every device you carry, every notification that interrupts your thought, these aren't neutral tools. They're specifically engineered to fragment your attention into the smallest possible units and monetize those fragments. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented business strategy. Tech companies employ neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists whose explicit job is to make their products as addictive as possible, to hijack your dopamine system, to exploit your evolutionary wiring, and they've succeeded beyond their wildest projections. The average person now fragments their attention every 40 seconds. They check their devices over 100 times daily. They consume the informational equivalent of 34 gigabytes of content per day, more than the human brain evolved to process. For someone with your consciousness, someone capable of perceiving across temporal dimensions, this is catastrophic, because the spiral perception Jung identified requires sustained cognitive continuity. It requires the ability to hold multiple timelines simultaneously, to track subtle patterns across duration, to dive deep enough that the unconscious can surface insights. All of that becomes impossible when your attention is being shattered every 40 seconds. You felt this erosion firsthand. The way you can't read a book without your mind wandering. The way even when you're alone, you're somehow not present. The way you reach for your phone during any moment of boredom or discomfort, training yourself out of the very stillness where creativity lives. This isn't personal failure. This is the systematic destruction of the cognitive architecture that makes depth possible. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately as a power play. Those who control attention control everything, because attention is the currency of consciousness. Where you place your attention determines what becomes real for you, what influences your decisions, what shapes your identity. Right now, your attention is being auctioned off in real-time bidding wars. Advertisers pay for milliseconds of your focus. Algorithms compete to keep you scrolling. Platforms design infinite feeds specifically to prevent you from ever feeling satisfied, complete, done. And all of it extracts a toll that compounds invisibly, the slow death of your capacity for sustained thought. Jung would call this the surrender of sovereignty. You've handed the keys to your consciousness to external systems that have zero interest in your well-being and every interest in your dependence. So what's the escape route? Not digital detox, not technological rejection, but conscious reclamation. First, recognize that every time you pick up your device, you're making a trade. You're trading the raw, unmediated present moment for the curated algorithmic simulation. Neither is inherently superior. But you must make the trade consciously, not compulsively. Most people check their phones not because they want information, but because they can't tolerate the discomfort of presence. They're fleeing themselves. Using distraction as anesthetic, you must do the opposite. You must become someone who can sit with discomfort without immediately medicating it with stimulus. Second, build temporal sanctuaries. Jung called these temenos, sacred enclosed spaces where the ordinary rules don't apply. For you, this means creating deliberate periods where the digital cannot enter. An hour after waking, a day per week, a weekend per month. Time that belongs entirely to you, ungoverned by external demands or inputs. During these sanctuaries, boredom will surface, anxiety will knock, the urge to check, to scroll, to stimulate will feel overwhelming. Do not yield, because on the other side of that discomfort is something you've almost forgotten. Your own mind, operating at its natural rhythm. Thoughts that emerge organically rather than being triggered by content. Insights that surface from silence rather than stimulation. Third, audit your inputs with brutal honesty. Not, is this interesting, but is this making me more sovereign or more dependent? The news cycle that keeps you perpetually anxious, dependent. The social media that triggers comparison and inadequacy, dependent. The productivity content that makes you feel you're never doing enough, dependent. The book that challenges you to grow, sovereign. The conversation that expands your capacity for nuance, sovereign. The silence that allows integration, sovereign. Machiavelli taught that the wise prince appears to have all virtues while being willing to act decisively when those virtues would cause harm. Translate. You must appear to be digitally engaged while secretly maintaining an interior life that exists independent of external validation. This is the modern rebellion Jung would endorse, not dropping out, not retreating, but becoming ungovernable at the level of attention. Choosing presence over performance, depth over distraction, the slow cultivation of self over the fast consumption of content. This requires discipline that feels almost monastic in a culture addicted to stimulation. But it's the only way back to the consciousness you came here to develop. The paradox of constraint, how limitation unlocks creation. Jung discovered something that contradicts modern assumptions about creativity. Boundaries don't limit freedom, they create it. He observed this in his own work. After his break with Freud, suddenly liberated from institutional constraints, he expected productivity to explode. Instead, he found himself paralyzed. Too many possibilities, too much freedom, no container to shape the chaos. So he built one. He established a routine, limited his focus, created artificial constraints that channeled his creative energy rather than letting it dissipate in all directions. And only then did the work begin to flow. This is the paradox every artist learns eventually. Infinite possibility produces nothing. Strategic limitation produces everything. You've experienced both sides of this equation. The wide open day where you promise yourself you'll finally write that book, create that art, build that business. 8 glorious hours of freedom stretching before you, and by evening you've produced almost nothing. The blank page remained blank. The potential remained potential. But give yourself 45 minutes between obligations. Suddenly you're in flow. Give yourself a tight deadline. Suddenly clarity emerges. Give yourself a constraint. One theme, one medium, one question. And suddenly the work takes shape. This isn't coincidence. This is consciousness responding to structure. Your brain, when faced with unlimited options, spends all its energy evaluating possibilities. Which direction? Which approach? Which version? The executive function becomes paralyzed by choice. But introduce a boundary, limited time, limited scope, limited resources, and suddenly the decision-making becomes trivial. There's only one path forward, the essential one. Everything else gets stripped away by necessity. Jung recognized this as the psychological function of ritual and routine, not as prisons but as vessels that give shape to formless creative energy. The writer who commits to 500 words before breakfast, the painter who works only in black and white, the entrepreneur who builds businesses with a 6-month timeline. They're not limiting themselves, they're focusing themselves, and Machiavelli understood this from a different angle. He observed that armies fighting on familiar terrain with clear objectives outperform larger armies with vague missions. That small kingdoms with defined borders survive longer than sprawling empires that try to hold too much territory. Constraint isn't weakness. Constraint is strategic clarity. But here's where most people get it wrong. They confuse constraint with restriction. They hear limitation and think less. They believe that narrowing focus means abandoning possibility. Jung would say the opposite. Narrowing focus means actually manifesting possibility. Because potential that remains general remains unrealized. You can have 1,000 ideas, or you can have one completed work. You can keep all your options open, or you can commit to one path and see where it leads. The fear, of course, is choosing wrong, committing to the path that turns out to be a dead end, investing your limited time in the project that doesn't work. But Jung's insight cuts through this fear. There are no wrong paths, only incomplete understanding. Every creative endeavor teaches you something, even if the thing itself fails. Every constraint you work within develops a capacity you didn't have before. Every completion, regardless of outcome, moves you closer to mastery. The amateur waits for perfect conditions. The professional creates conditions that force production. This is why you need to stop waiting for more time, more resources, more clarity. Start with the constraint you have right now. 90 minutes, one theme. Whatever tools are immediately available. And the commitment to produce something even if it's imperfect, rather than producing nothing while waiting for ideal circumstances. Nietzsche wrote about this as the will to power. Not power over others, but power over the inertia within yourself. The ability to choose a direction and commit fully, knowing you can change course later if needed. This is the practice. Artificial limitation in service of actual creation. Instead of, I'll work on this until it's done, try, I have 90 minutes to produce a rough version. What's the minimum viable expression of this idea? This does three things simultaneously. First, it defeats perfectionism. There's no time to make it perfect, only time to make it exist. Second, it activates creative urgency without the toxicity of external pressure. You're using urgency as a tool, not being used by it. Third, it trains your unconscious to respond faster. Your creative mind learns that when the constraint is set, it's time to produce. The muse stops waiting to be inspired and shows up on schedule. But, and this is essential, constraint must alternate with expansion. Work in sprints, rest in cycles. 90 minutes of deep focus, 20 minutes of complete release. Push until you empty, then stop completely until you refill. Jung emphasized that the psyche operates in rhythms, not straight lines. Contraction and expansion, inhalation and exhalation. The squeeze that creates pressure and the release that allows integration. If you only contract, you'll snap. If you only expand, you'll dissipate. The rhythm between the two creates the spiral of growth. This is how you honor both your capacity for intensity and your need for recovery. You work like everything depends on it during the sprint. You rest like nothing matters during the recovery. And you trust the rhythm to produce results that constant grinding never could. The vertical path. Jung's final teaching and your liberation. Near the end of his life, Jung wrote something that the self-improvement industry has systematically ignored. He said that the central task of the second half of life isn't accumulation or achievement. It's the acceptance of what has always been true. Not becoming who you're supposed to be. Not optimizing yourself into a better version. But recognizing and accepting who you already are beneath all the performance, conditioning, and desperate attempts to be acceptable. This is the teaching no one wants to sell you. Because acceptance doesn't require a course. It doesn't need a coach. It doesn't create dependency on external systems. But it's the only path to freedom. You've spent years, maybe decades, trying to fix what you believed was broken in you. Your strange relationship with time. Your inability to care about things others find important. Your tendency to go deep in a world that rewards staying shallow. And Jung is telling you, there was never anything to fix. What if your temporal experience isn't a disorder but a diagnostic tool? What if the way time drags during meaningless activity and expands during aligned work is your consciousness showing you the difference between authentic and inauthentic living? What if your intolerance for shallow productivity isn't laziness but integrity? Your soul refusing to participate in performances that violate your nature? What if everything you've been taught to pathologize is actually the navigation system trying to guide you toward alignment? Jung called this shift the vertical life, as opposed to the horizontal life of accumulation, status, and external validation. The horizontal life asks, how much can I acquire? How high can I climb? How many metrics can I improve? The vertical life asks, how deep can I go? How true can I become? How aligned is my inner reality with my outer expression? Most people live horizontally. They measure worth by possessions, achievements, followers, accomplishments. They arrive at the end decorated with medals that feel hollow because they were earned at the expense of the soul. You cannot sustain horizontal living. You've tried. It made you physically ill. You are built for depth, not breadth, for intensity, not extension, for meaning, not metrics, for the quality of presence, not the quantity of production. This is the dangerous truth Jung discovered and the world desperately wants suppressed. The vertical life doesn't reward you with anything the horizontal world values. No massive wealth, no widespread fame, no clear metrics to prove your worth to others. But it offers something the horizontal world can never provide, the internal alignment that makes existence feel worth enduring. The sense that you're living your actual life, not a simulation of someone else's expectations. The relief of no longer performing for an audience that was never going to be satisfied anyway. The freedom of measuring yourself against your own internal standards rather than external comparisons. Nietzsche saw this coming when he wrote about the death of God, not as atheism, but as the collapse of external authority. The moment when humanity has to face the terrifying freedom of creating meaning rather than inheriting it. You're living in that moment. The old systems that told people who to be and how to live are dying, and you're among the first generation forced to figure out your own answers. This is why you feel so displaced. The horizontal world still dominates, still runs the corporations, controls the economy, designs the education system, defines success. But it's crumbling, and your displacement from it isn't exile, it's early arrival to what comes next. Machiavelli understood that real power belongs to those who define their own terms. Not the power to control others, but the power to be ungovernable. To operate according to internal principles that external systems cannot touch. This is your inheritance. This is the gift embedded in what felt like a curse. Your strange relationship with time is actually immunity to the temporal colonization that enslaves the majority. While others trade hours for dollars and measure worth by productivity, you've been granted the ability to measure worth by depth, truth, and alignment. But this immunity comes with responsibility. Jung's final teaching was this: the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you're supposed to be. Not who would make others comfortable. Not who fits the algorithm or satisfies the audience. Who you actually are beneath the performance, the fear, and the accumulated layers of conditioning. And the only way to discover that is to stop running from the discomfort of not knowing. To sit with the uncertainty, to make peace with the ambiguity, to trust that the spiral you're on, rising and falling, expanding and contracting, is taking you exactly where you need to go. Even when you can't see the destination, the world doesn't need you to be more productive. It needs you to be more present, more real, more willing to speak the truths that everyone else is too frightened to acknowledge. It needs you to demonstrate that there's another way to measure a life. That depth matters more than speed. That meaning matters more than metrics. That a single moment lived in full consciousness is worth more than a decade of unconscious performance. Jung believed you could do this. That people like you, displaced, temporally sovereign, unable to conform, are the medicine the world needs even when it can't recognize the cure. The question he left you with is devastatingly simple. Will you finally stop apologizing for how you perceive reality and start trusting it? Before we finish, remember this. The rarest personality type on Earth isn't defined by what you accomplish or how much you produce. It's defined by how you perceive the architecture of time itself. You don't move through duration the way others do. You spiral. You expand and contract. You sense the future pressing against the present and carry the past as a living presence rather than a dead memory. This has made you strange, misunderstood, exhaustingly different. But it has also made you essential because the world is drowning in horizontal ambition, in shallow productivity, in the frantic accumulation of experiences that mean nothing and achievements that ring hollow. And someone needs to demonstrate the vertical path. Someone needs to live proof that depth matters more than breadth, that alignment matters more than accomplishment, that one conscious moment lived in truth is worth more than a lifetime of performance. Jung spent decades mapping this territory so that people like you wouldn't get lost in the darkness. Now the map is in your hands. The only question left is whether you'll trust it, trust yourself enough to follow it into the depths where your actual life is waiting. The spiral doesn't end. It only goes deeper, and you were never meant to walk the straight line anyway. You were meant to show us what exists beneath the surface, where time stops lying and consciousness finally tells the truth.